Welcome to Lesson 5.1, Understanding Access Control Fundamentals. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Identity and Access Management domain. We are in Key Area of Knowledge A, which is Control Physical and Logical Access to Assets. Our topics for this lesson are going to include access management objectives, types of access controls, and access control system attributes. The primary objective of access management is to protect information and information systems from unauthorized access, that's going to be confidentiality, modification, that's our integrity, and disruption, availability. So again, the primary objective of access management is to protect information and information systems from unauthorized access, modification, and disruption. Access management controls are security mechanisms that control how subjects and objects communicate and interact with each other and the flow of information. Now, we talked about subjects and objects when we were talking about security models, but as a reminder, a subject is an active entity that requests access to an object or data within an object. An object is an entity being accessed or the item being acted upon. So our subject is our active entity, our object is our passive entity. We need to perform access management across our entire enterprise. Facilities access, information systems access, and personnel access. So our facilities access controls or access management is designed to restrict or to allow access to and movement around physical locations. Our information systems access controls or management is designed to restrict or to allow access to network segments, devices, and data. And our personnel access controls or access management is designed to restrict or allow access to facilities, resources, and operations, and to enforce accountability for user actions so we know who did what. Then there's a number of different types of access controls. Access controls can be technical, access controls can be administrative, and access controls can be physical. And many of these I'm sure you're already familiar with, or perhaps you interact with on a daily basis. So for example, our technical access controls can include access control lists, firewalls, passwords, smart cards, biometrics, encryption, callback systems, audit trails, and intrusion detection systems. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just a sample list. Our administrative access controls can include policies and procedures, information classification, security awareness training, separation of duties, rotation of duties, security clearances, background checks, and mandatory vacation time. Physical access controls include badges, biometrics, a man trap, a turnstile, a lock, an alarm, a guard, a fence, a motion detector, anything that restricts or allows physical access. Access control systems share common attributes. Access control systems will have an identification schema, an authentication method, an authorization model, and an accounting process. In this lesson, I'm going to introduce you to each of those, the identification schemas, authentication methods, authorization models, and accounting processes. And in the subsequent lessons, we're going to go through each one of those individually. So we'll look at identification schemes, we'll look at authentication, and we will look at authorization separately. So an identification schema is used to identify unique records in a set. We require that records are unique so that we can have accountability. An authentication method is how identification is proven to be genuine. So somebody says, I'm Sari. Well, how do we prove that you're Sari? And that proof will be our authentication method. An authorization model defines how access rights and permissions are granted. Now, that's going to be how access rights and permissions are granted to a subject that has been authenticated. So first we identify who they are. We authenticate them by verifying their identity, and then they become authorized, meaning that they have specific rights and permissions based on who they are. And lastly, the accounting process is used to track subject actions. That gives us accountability, the ability to trace actions back to a source. Identification is the activity of the subject supplying information to identify itself to an authentication service. And when we combine that with an audit trail, identification will provide accountability. So an audit trail gives us a record of actions and tells us who did it. And because we've identified our subjects, positively identified them, we're going to be able to get accountability. So there are a number of identification schemes. The ones we're going to be looking at in this course are Directory Services, LDAP, SSO, which is also single sign-on, and then SAML, OpenID, OpenAuth, EAP, and Web Services. Authentication is the process of providing credentials to verify the identification of a subject. The one you're probably most familiar with is your password. When you go to log in to your system, you say, this is who I am, this is my username, that was your identification, and then you put in your password. And your password is your authentication part. It's the process of providing the credentials to verify identification of the subject, and then for the authentication authority to accept those credentials and allow you to proceed. There are a number of authentication methods, and the ones we're going to explore in these lessons are factor-based, biometric, cryptographic, and federated. Authorization is the process of assigning our authenticated subjects, that's important, they've already identified themselves and been verified, so authorization is the process of assigning authenticated subjects access as well as the right to carry out a specific operation depending upon pre-configured access rights and permissions that have been outlined in the access criteria. So this is where we are going to assign rights and permissions. Authorization models include discretionary, mandatory, rule-based, and constrained. And we're going to be looking at each one of those as well as some ancillary authorization models and techniques. And that brings us to accounting and accountability. Accounting is the logging of access and use. But accountability is the process of tracing actions to their source. So accountability processes include not just logging this, but very importantly, doing user activity reviews so we can see who's doing what and we can look at patterns or perhaps pick up some wrongdoing. Monitoring system access, so who is accessing the system, when and from where. And then mining audit log data to look for predictors of compromise or indicators of compromise. So when we put this all together, if we look at an access management system and we look at the relationship between the components that we just spoke about, we have identification provides uniqueness. Identification is how a subject says, this is who I am. Authentication provides validity. So authentication is how the subject proves their identity. Authorization provides control because authorization is the process of assigning rights and permissions to authenticated subjects which allow them to perform or not perform certain actions. And accountability provides non-repudiation. So when we log activities and then we see an authenticated user, we can say that this activity can be traced back to that user. So that was really an overview of access management. Let's do a brief review, and then we'll go into our match the meanings. We looked at access management objectives. We talked about types of access controls and the fact that access controls happen throughout the enterprise, that we have facilities access controls, we have technology access controls, we have personnel access controls, and those controls can be administrative, they can be physical, or they can be technical. We looked at various access control system attributes of identification, authentication, authorization, and accounting. So that brings us right to our match the meaning. You've got some new terms and some terms that you were introduced to previously. The terms are subject, object, identification, authentication, authorization, accounting, and accountability. These should all be familiar to you now, but we want to make sure. So what I'd like you to do is put me on pause. It should take a minute or two, that's all. You should be able to match these meanings pretty quickly now, then come on back and we'll verify that you got them right. All right, welcome back, and I'm betting on 100% here. A subject is your active entity. Your object is your passive entity. Identification is information about a subject. It's how the subject says, this is who I am. Authentication is how we validate or verify the identification of a subject. Authorization is when we assign rights and permissions to an authorized subject. Accounting is the logging of activity, and accountability is when we can trace actions right back to their source. I hope you did great. So we're going to end this lesson with our CISSP exam tips. Authentication provides validity, authorization provides control, and accountability provides non-repudiation. Now you notice I have sometimes in parentheses. And an example would be where accountability doesn't provide non-repudiation is I'm a logged-in user. I leave my computer unlocked and unattended, so now it's in my security context. Somebody else sits down at my machine and does something. Well, accountability will now be traced back to the source, the user that logged in, but that may in fact not be who actually performed that activity. So we also have to make sure that we put other controls in place that we can depend on our accounting systems to truly tell us who performed the action. So thank you very much for joining me for this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next.